Oh, big crack. Wow, that one gave hard. There's been a long time debate exactly what are the best materials to use for French cleats and exactly how strong are they. So today, we're hopefully going to answer both of those questions. Now, I could have used one or two of the French cleats I currently have up, but I didn't want to take a chance of messing up my walls. So I decided to build this fake wall setup. It's primarily made out of 2x4s, and I have the frame at a 16-inch center, which should be pretty similar to what you'd find in most houses. Now, I do have some 1/2 inch MDF on the front and the back to give it some extra support and to act like the actual wall. Now, down at the bottom, I have some extra bracing just in case this thing likes to flex. There's very little chance it will give much. I want this to act like it will be a wall in your house or in your shop, so it'd be really, really strong and rigid. Now, when it comes to the wall cleats, I personally like to choose 1x4 pine boards, but that's just me. I know a lot of people like plywood, so let me show you the materials we're going to test. Now, in no particular order, we have some birch plywood. No, it's not Baltic birch. That's nearly impossible to find nowadays. This is just what you'd find in your big box store. We have some pine plywood. We have some MDF. And some people have been asking about OSB, so we'll test that as well. And of course, my go-to, pine 1x4. Now, I always suggest using 3/4 of an inch material whenever you're using French cleats. Now, the plywood I'm using is really close. I think it's 23-30 seconds. It's just a little under 3/4. Otherwise, everything else we're testing is 3/4. Now, I trimmed on each of these larger pieces to 1 foot because I want to use an interior piece of the wood. Just in case there's some defects on the outside, it's not part of the problem. So I'm going to go in here and cut out the cleats now. But just in case, for example, right here on this board, there's some imperfections. I'm going to try and cut a little bit further in so there's less likely to have any of those. Now, we want the French cleats to be the same exact size across all of them. That way it's an even test. And to do that, I'm going to first cut out this 1x4 board. Now, I have my table saw set at 2 3/4. That should get the most yield out of this board. And then I'm going to cut these the same. Now, since some of the wood is a little bit different in size, I decided to cut a corresponding cleat from the same material. That way, when we're putting these together in our testing block, there's no difference in size. Now, I've attached each of these cleats to a 2x4 because that's what I'm going to use to pull down on. I went with a 3-inch cleat because I looked around my shop and the smallest cleat I had was about 3 inches. Now, as your cleats get wider on your tool holders, they'll provide less stress to one specific spot on your wall cleats and therefore be able to hold more weight. But I figured 3 inches was a good starting point so we can see what our limit is. And now it's time for you to guess which one of these is going to be the strongest. Is it going to be the OSB, the MDF, the pine plywood, the birch plywood, or the solid pine board? Please put your answers in the comments. And while you're writing that down, I just have to give a quick disclaimer that these are not scientific tests. This is just tests done in my workshop. So my materials might differ a little bit from your materials. So just remember that whenever you're putting a lot of weight up on French cleats, you're taking it under your own risk. And to hopefully find out the exact weight these cleats can hold, I purchased a brand new crane scale that can go up to 500 kilograms. I've added the OSB to our frame first because I have a feeling it's going to be one of the weaker pieces that we're going to be testing out here. I always recommend putting 2 screws into each stud for each cleat, and that is what I've done here. I've also added 2 screws to the back of each of our test pieces. This is what we're going to be pulling down on. Just in case the glue starts to shear off, these 2 screws should hold it in place. And here's how we're going to pull this. We have a strap running over the 2x4 that goes down to our scale, our crane scale there, which goes down to our load binder to get a bunch of leverage on. That's hooked to a chain around the bottom of the frame. Now, the weight of the tools we're using here are about 10 pounds, so I'll add that to the final weight. First, with the OSB, okay, I hear it popping really good up here already. See how much more it'll take. There we go. Whew, good thing I had a hat on. It didn't actually break this. You know, we'll show it closer. Oh, I didn't have the flipping thing on. 2 things. First off, I just realized I didn't have the scale on, so I'm going to try and redo this test. But first off, let's look at the problems where it gave. It obviously gave on the back here before it actually gave on the wall. That surprised me just a little bit, but I should have figured that because there's less material on here. It did tear real bad here on the front. So let's put up 1 more of these and actually have the scale on this time. I'm going to give a little extra time for the glue to dry on this secondary OSB test, and we're going to move ahead and try out the MDF. Here's some cracking. Wow, that's tight. There we go, some tearing, and it gave. Now let's take this off and look a little closer, see what happened. Okay, the MDF, it did split right here in the middle. The backing here still seems nice and strong, but if you look at it, both sides are pointing down, so I have a feeling it did break here, but possibly part of the problem was the connection over here. Now I took the cleat off to take a closer look at this backing board. It looks like it did give a little bit, but it's hard to tell on these screws, but they're bent a little bit as well. So it took enough pressure to start to bend the screws and the backing board before the MDF gave out. Now it's time for the pine plywood. I am using 4 new screws and I have offsetted a little bit from the original holes. I'm hearing some cracking. That's hard. Big crack. There we go. The cleat on the wall, still nice and strong. It is a little bit damaged on the edge, and I have a feeling that's what happened when the holder came apart. This right here sheared glue, sheared some of the plywood apart, yanked out the screws, but overall, this cleat on the wall, it's a really nice unit using just regular pine plywood. Next up, birch plywood. You're cracking. And something just gave. At a closer look, once again, the wall cleat held up fine. In fact, this doesn't even have hardly any edge damage. There's a little tiny bit right here, but nothing to even worry about. Now, the holder again gave out and it sheared wood and glue and again yanked out the screws. So overall, if you're gonna use birch plywood, very good choice. Next up is the solid pine board. A little bit of cracking. Oh, big crack. Wow, that one gave hard. Looking at this pine board a little bit closer, it gave on one of the rings of the board, which is not surprising because that's one of the weaker parts whenever you're putting a lot of leverage on a board. Now, the edge here on the wall cleat, well, it's messed up. It pulls apart just a little bit. It didn't break nearly as bad as the holder, and this, I guess in a pinch, still could be usable, but it doesn't appear to be as strong as the plywood. And now we're going to head back to the OSB to give it one more shot, and this time with the scale on. Already hearing some cracking. And that was not nearly as difficult as it was with the plywood. Now if you look at the wall holder and at the wall cleat here, my goodness, both of these are destroyed. You can't fix that. Now that we have all 5 materials tested, let's go look at the numbers once again and compare all 5. Whew, now that was a workout trying to break this wood. Alright, quick review. On the OSB, it had a full failure on the wall and on the holder. For the MDF, it had a full failure on the wall, but not the holder. On the pine plywood, it had a full failure on the holder, and it cracked it just slightly here on the actual wall unit. I'd say this is potentially still usable, but may want to be cautious of it. On the birch plywood, full failure on the holder, and it still looks pristine on the actual wall unit. Looking over at the last one is the pine board. Of course, the full failure on the holder, it broke along the actual lines of the wood. And I'd say a partial failure here on the actual wall unit. It could probably still be usable, but it is cracked pretty good. Now with the OSB, it first started to crack around 260 pounds and fully broke at about 530 pounds. That's still a lot of weight, but it is the lowest of all of the pieces tested. And that is why people don't suggest to use this for French cleats. Looking at the MDF, it first started to crack around 410 pounds and fully gave out at about 630 pounds. That's pretty good numbers, except one thing you need to keep in mind. This is the only board that actually fully broke. I mean, it fully gave. The others broke off mainly around the edge. This one completely snapped. So keep in mind that even though this right here has numbers close to the liters, it fully gave out. The others did not. Also, one thing with MDF, if you don't have a fully climate controlled building or workshop, there's a very good chance that moisture will slowly seep into this, making it even weaker. Now let's look at the last three. These three I usually recommend for people starting their French cleat wall. Now this is of course pine plywood. I have a hardwood, or in this case it's birch plywood, and a solid pine board or solid board itself. Now the pine plywood started to first crack around 500, the birch plywood around 440, and the pine board around 420. The full breakage of the holder in all three cases, it was at 630, 550, and 620. Now, even though the hardwood, the birch plywood, had a lower number compared to these other two, if you look at it, it is not messed up at all. I have a feeling all the cracking and all the full breakage that happened was just in the holder, and the board that it was attached to was just too weak to hold it anymore. So looking at all three of these, even though the two outer ones took the most wear and tear or breakage, they could still in essence be used if used carefully. The birch plywood of course is no damage at all, but again it had about 80 pounds less pulling on it. So make your own choice on which one of these you would like to use. I would definitely avoid MDF and OSB, but any type of your plywood that you would like, or maybe even solid boards that you like, they should work well for you. Now I hope this answers some of your questions you have about the strength of French cleats. Now if you like French cleats and you want some ideas, I have a playlist right over here with literally hundreds of ideas, so make sure you check it out.